So now we're going to continue on our discussion about the Constitution, but we're sort of like pre-Constitution at this stage. We're going to be talking about the Declaration of Independence and then the Articles of Confederation, which were actually the first Constitution of the United States, but it just was one that didn't work. And I'd like to talk about the Declaration of Independence for a couple reasons. First, while we tend to think of it sort of reverentially as this document that should be in a glass case and people should walk around and look at it and go, ooh, it was really a revolutionary document when it was written. And it was a document that made claims that frightened the rest of the world because it was proposing a form of governance that was at odds with what was being done elsewhere. At the same time, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution that eventually followed are also important in that from the very beginning, our country failed to live up to the very ideals that it was expressing. And I think it's worth noting both of those things. One, it was a revolutionary document. Two, we failed to live up to it from the very origins of our country. And that's important, not to attack the United States or anything, but to be realistic and honest about the United States and our founding. Following that, we'll talk about the Articles of Confederation and the way it was organized with an emphasis on the failures of the Articles of Confederation and why it eventually was abandoned in favor of the Constitution, the new Constitution, the one that we're living under now. So we're on, as you can see, we're on the Constitution video number 3. So most of the world was organized around the idea of natural rights or divine rights. The idea was basically this, that most countries were organized around the idea that there was a king, and the reason that the king was a king is because the king was chosen by God to be king. So the source of a king's power was really God. God selected them to be king, and then their family that followed, they were also going to be chosen by God to be rulers as well. And so opposing the king was equivalent to opposing God. Now, in some of those countries, citizens had rights. They did have rights. But the thing was about citizens' rights, the source of citizens' rights, the king was the source of the citizens' rights. And if the king can give you your rights, then what does that mean? The king can take them away. And so any property that somebody owned, if they had a right to property, it was only because the king gave them the right to property, and that meant the king could take it away. The Constitution, the Declaration of Independence proposed a different way of thinking about governance and the way government works. And I'm going to read a portion of the Declaration of Independence that you probably heard but maybe never really given deep thought to. So this is a quote, and probably most of you, although not all of you, have heard it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute a new government. Okay, sometimes Old English is like sort of hard to understand, so let me break that down in like sort of what does that really mean? What that paragraph is saying, and it was written by Thomas Jefferson, who, by the way, owned slaves, had enslaved human beings for the duration of his life. What it's saying is that the source of citizens' rights come from God. That's what they mean by all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. That is the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's given to everybody by virtue of being a human being. and it's given to them by God. And the source of the government's power doesn't come from God. It comes from that phrase right there, the consent of the governed. In other words, the people. The government has power, and that power is given to the government by the people. And that so governments are essentially formed in order to protect the rights that God has given everybody. That's what it means by to secure these rights that God gives everybody by virtue of being human beings. Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The people, that's where the government gets its power. And that governments are formed to protect these natural rights. That's the job of the government, to protect the rights of people, to protect the rights that God has given people by virtue of them being human beings. And then most importantly and most scary to the powers around the world, this last sentence, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and institute a new government. In other words, what it's saying is if the government fails to protect these natural rights, it is the right of the people to get rid of that government. I would argue that it's the duty of people to get rid of that government and replace it with one that will protect the rights that God created, that God gives human beings by virtue of them being human beings. That is a bold statement and very different from the idea of divine rights, very different. But again, at the same time that Jefferson was writing this beautiful paragraph and talking about these beautiful ideas, he was enslaving human beings. And that contradiction between the noble ideas expressed in this part of the Declaration of Independence and that would be later expressed in the Constitution was at complete odds with how our society was functioning at that time. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but I don't think it can be stressed enough. I think it's critically important for us to understand that. So once independence is declared, right, and we break away from Britain, the framers get together, or the framers of the original Constitution, and that is the Articles of Confederation. They create a new system, right? Remember I talked to you about the difference between unitary, federalists, and confederations. This is the confederation that they create. It lasts about 11 years and it becomes apparent that it's not working. And this is sort of how the Articles of Confederation were structured and how the government was structured as a result of the Articles of Confederation. First, there was a Congress, right? But there was only one vote each state in this Congress, and each state had one vote. Each state had one vote regardless of its size. So the big states, the small states, they all had the same influence over the laws. The framers were also worried about the national government being too powerful. So when they wrote the Articles of Confederation, right, the national government couldn't regulate commerce between or trade between the states. States actually put tariffs on goods from other states. They treated each other as separate countries almost, separate entities. The national government couldn't compel states to even pay taxes. Everything that the government does, the national government does, it has to pay for, and it couldn't even get taxes paid. And it couldn't compel the states to obey the laws that it passed because there was no enforcement mechanism built into the Articles of Confederation that allowed the federal government to do that. There was no system of national courts. Every state basically functioned independently with its own rules. And each state could issue its own paper money. So just imagine if California had a dollar, dollars and coins, if Arizona had one, if Florida had their own, if Texas had their own. Commerce and our economy would be so difficult to interact with one another that it would be a real problem, and that's exactly what happened under the Articles of Confederation. It became very clear in a fairly short amount of time that the Articles of Confederation weren't going to work. And so the framers got together and said, we need to convene again, and we need to come up with a new constitution. What they came up with was what we refer to as the Constitution of the United States. It was actually the second constitution. The first one was called the Articles of Confederation. And in the next video, I'm going to talk about the Constitution of the United States.